In November of 2007, a scientist stood on the edge of a 50-foot wide crater in the Peruvian high desert. The crater was full of water. But despite its innocent-looking appearance, this crater full of water held incredible danger. When it formed 2 months earlier, hundreds of people and animals in the area had gotten violently sick, and so far, no one had come up with a good explanation for how this was possible. In fact, according to the laws of physics, the crater shouldn't even exist. It was a mystery that had researchers all over the planet scratching their heads. But as the scientist stared down into the big crater, he thought he might have the answer to both of these mysteries. And if he was right, it would mean that the threat posed by this crater was far greater than anyone imagined. It was a chilly morning on September 15, 2007. A sheep farmer named Gregorio Yaruri sat on his porch, sipping a mug of coffee and looking at the distant mountain peaks that surrounded his hometown of Carancas, a small village in southern Peru. It was silent except for the sheep bleating in the pasture. Then Gregorio heard a low sound, like a hum. At first, the noise was faint, and it sounded like it was coming from miles away. Then the hum grew louder, and the coffee in his mug started to vibrate. A moment later, pebbles on the ground surrounding his porch began to shake as the hum turned into a roar. Alarmed, Gregorio set down his mug and leaped down into the yard. He looked around, trying to figure out if the noise was human-made or maybe an earthquake. He covered his ears as the hum roared to a deafening scream. Then he spotted something small and orange streaking through the sky. An instant later, a sonic boom whipped across the valley, shattering a window in Gregorio's house. He was thrown onto his back and he rolled a few times before steadying himself in the dirt. Noises began to erupt all across the plain. Gregorio could hear dogs howling and shouts coming from some of the neighboring farms. Gregorio was bracing himself for something else to happen, but the sky above him was bright blue again. So he stood up, feeling totally shell-shocked, as he brushed the dust from his pants. He scanned the horizon for some clue as to what had caused this explosion. In the distance, he could see a plume of thick black smoke rising 100 feet into the air. At first, Gregorio was filled with dread. Then, a sense of determination swelled up inside of him. He needed to know what had just fallen from the sky. He ran for the bicycle he kept leaning up against the side of his house. He brushed the glass shards from his broken window off the seat, and then he hopped on and he set his feet on the pedals and took off towards the tower of smoke. As Gregorio neared the site of impact, the smell of rotten eggs stung the inside of his nostrils. He pulled over just long enough to grab his bandana out of his back pocket and tie it around his face to block the smell. About 100 feet from the tower of smoke, he noticed red dust covering the ground. The closer he got, the thicker the blanket of dust seemed to be. When he finally reached the base of the smoke plume, he rubbed the dust with his feet. It appeared to be clay that had been kicked up by the crash. The smoke was so thick, he still couldn't tell what had impacted the ground. But whatever it was, it had created what appeared to be a huge crater in the ground. The column of smoke was emerging from a hole about 50 feet across. It really looked like someone had just detonated a bomb there. A few minutes later, the smoke started thinning out, and Gregorio could finally see into this crater. He walked up to the edge, and his eyes widened from a combination of fear and wonder. The crater was filled with a dark green liquid. The liquid had a consistency somewhere between maybe water and sludge, and it was bubbling as if it was simmering. Gregorio pinched his nose through the bandana. The egg smell coming off of this crater was so strong that he felt sick to his stomach. He walked around the perimeter of the crater, kicking at the shards of clay and jagged rock that littered the ground. It looked like someone had smashed a huge vase to pieces. Gregorio scanned the horizon. It seemed like he was the only person who'd come to investigate this plume of smoke. He figured the neighboring farmers must be worried that whatever crashed into the ground was a bad omen. A lot of his neighbors still believed in ancient spirits. But after a while, it struck Gregorio as kind of odd that not even an emergency vehicle had come out to survey the scene. Something had just shot out of the sky and smashed into the earth. It felt like that was the kind of thing police would want to know about. But Gregorio knew help would not be coming from his village. Only about 250 people lived in Carancas, so it didn't have its own police force. The authorities were located in the nearby town of Desaguadero, which was about 7 miles up the road. Gregorio wasn't sure if the folks in Desaguadero would be able to see the smoke plume from there. If they couldn't, he worried that the authorities might not even know this happened. Gregorio jumped back on his bicycle and pedaled to the house of a neighbor who owned a motorcycle that Gregorio knew he'd be able to borrow. It was going to be up to him to raise the alarm, and he had to get out there fast. About 20 minutes later, Gregorio parked his borrowed motorcycle in front of the police station in Desaguadero and then walked inside. He was greeted by a tired-looking receptionist with the phone pressed to her ear. It seemed like she'd been talking to people for hours. 3 deputies were talking loudly about an airstrike. It took a minute for Gregorio to realize what was going on. The police did know about this explosion. One of them had seen the orange streak in the sky. But they thought that Carancas had actually been struck by a missile. Gregorio waved down one of the officers and explained he had seen a crater filled with this green ooze that smelled terrible. The officer disappeared into a back room for a moment, and then he returned with the chief of police. They asked if Gregorio could lead them to the crash site. Gregorio agreed. Soon, he was back on his neighbor's motorcycle, leading police cars along the 7-mile road back to the Carancas countryside. As the crash site came into view, Gregorio could see people moving around the rim of the crater. As he drew even closer, he realized that dozens of villagers from Carancas had come to see what had caused the smoke. He guessed that when the black plume of smoke had dissipated, the neighbors figured it was now safe to come take a look. Gregorio pulled over his motorcycle about 20 yards from the crater and dismounted. The police cars fanned out around him. As policemen approached the perimeter of the crater, Gregorio noticed his neighbors picking up rock fragments as souvenirs and pointing at the green liquid at the bottom of the massive hole. Gregorio overheard a nearby couple speculate that maybe this was the result of a missile strike from Peru's neighbor and rival, Chile. One teenage boy was talking excitedly, telling his friends they were probably just attacked by a UFO. An old woman, who Gregorio assumed was the boy's grandmother, told him to be quiet. This was clearly a sign of bad things to come, a curse sent by the spirits. She sounded terrified. Gregorio did not find any of these theories very convincing. However, he wasn't ready to offer any of his own. But the strange explosion had him just as curious as his neighbors. He picked up a shard of deep red rock near his feet and slipped it into his coat pocket, just as another car pulled onto the scene. Gregorio recognized the mayor of Carancas, Maximiliano Trujillo. Mayor Trujillo stepped out of the back seat, squinting in the sunlight. The mayor walked toward the crater, looking stunned. He stopped right next to Gregorio and asked what happened. Gregorio just shrugged, still in disbelief. Straight ahead of them, a pile of black rocks were smoking at the edge of the crater. The mayor's eyes widened when he saw them, and he began walking toward the crater to get a better look. By late afternoon, hundreds of people had gathered at the crash site. Gregorio stood near the front of the crowd, hoping that if he stuck around long enough, the police might announce what had caused this explosion. As the sun started to set, the smell of rotten eggs returned. It was faint, but pungent. Gregorio's eyes began to water. He pulled his bandana back up over his face, but that didn't work anymore. The smell was giving him a headache. A few minutes later, a short woman standing near Gregorio leaned over and began vomiting, and she wasn't the only one. People all around the crater were starting to get sick. Between the rotten smell coming off the green sludge and now the vomit, the air around the crater was now so thick that Gregorio thought he might faint. He fought his way through the crowd back to his motorcycle and sped off towards home, sucking in the fresh air as he went. When he walked through his front door, his phone was ringing. It was his son, who had moved about 6 hours away for a job after he had graduated school. As Gregorio told him about the afternoon's excitement, he took the rock out of his pocket and he laid it on the kitchen table. He began to describe its deep red color, but his son cut him off. He begged Gregorio not to touch it. If Carancas was attacked by a missile, then this red rock could very likely be radioactive. Gregorio remembered the people getting sick at the crater. He felt a surge of anxiety, and he covered the rock with a dish towel. If his son was right, half the town was now vulnerable, and Gregorio spent more time at the crater than anyone else. Panicked, he hung up on his son and ran outside to hose himself off. He didn't know how much it would help, but he had to do something. He spent the rest of the evening feeling totally anxious, until finally he managed to fall asleep. The next morning, Gregorio woke up with the sun as usual. He still felt a bit queasy, but no worse than the night before. He breathed a big sigh of relief, because he figured that radiation poisoning would have made him feel a lot sicker by now, and so probably he was in the clear. As the sunrise turned the sky a vivid pink, Gregorio walked out of his house towards the sheep pen. He grabbed tufts of hay and dried grass and scattered them on the ground, and the sheep came running over to graze. Gregorio watched until one of the sheep picked its head up and ambled away. Then he noticed something unusual. There were dark splotches on the hay right where the sheep's head had been. It took Gregorio a moment to realize what he was looking at. He walked over and grabbed the sheep that had ambled off, and he lifted its head up, and blood was trickling out of its nose. Then he looked at the ground. Another splotch of blood stained the hay beneath his feet. As he walked the length of the pen, he found drops of blood spattered all over the ground. Gregorio rushed inside and called his vet, expecting to leave a voicemail since it was still early, but to his surprise, the vet actually picked up. He sounded wide awake, like he'd already been up for hours. He said that he'd been getting calls all morning. Livestock across Carancas were getting sick. The vet promised to make Gregorio's farm his next stop. Gregorio thanked him and hung up. He had no idea what kind of sickness had emerged from that crater, but it seemed like it could be deadly. A few days after the crash, Mayor Trujillo walked between rooms at a health clinic. Every exam table had been turned into a makeshift hospital bed. More than 200 people who visited the crash site had flooded the hospital in Desaguadero. They were all sick with migraine headaches, and they were vomiting. The hospital got so overwhelmed with patients, they diverted people to smaller health clinics throughout the city, which were now acting as satellite operations. Mayor Trujillo had called the Red Cross to help administer care in these satellite clinics, but now even the clinics were completely full. The smell inside the packed clinic was terrible. People were retching and crying. To the mayor, it felt like he was walking through a war zone. Thankfully, he'd received confirmation that morning from the authorities in Lima, the capital of Peru, that Carancas had not been attacked by a missile. In fact, scientists said that the crater had been caused by a meteorite. Mayor Trujillo was relieved that they were not under attack, but a mystery remained. Nobody knew why people were now getting sick. Meteorites had never been known to have that kind of effect. Specialists were flying out from Lima to investigate further. Mayor Trujillo moved through the crowd of patients in the waiting room, trying his best to reassure them. He stopped by a Red Cross doctor who was tending to a small elderly woman on a folding chair. The mayor greeted the old woman and then thanked the doctor for traveling all this way to Desaguadero. The doctor stood upright, looking tired but hopeful. He explained that all the patients' blood work was coming back normal. He didn't know why they were sick, but judging from their symptoms, he said everyone should make a full recovery in a few days. Trujillo smiled with relief, but the old woman hissed and called the doctor a liar. Many of the patients around her nodded in agreement, eyeing the doctor like he was in on some big conspiracy. He heard them muttering about evil spirits causing this disaster. Trujillo knew that many villagers believed the meteorite was a curse from the ancient spirits, and because of that, many had refused to listen to the Red Cross doctors and aid workers. To Trujillo, this was the problem with people of the Carancas region. Outsiders never came to the area, so many of the villagers didn't trust them. Trujillo knew that Carancas was not cursed. He just needed to find a way to get his people to listen. Then an idea struck. Maybe he could get them to believe the science with the help of someone who could appease the spirits. Trujillo left the health clinic, climbed into his car, and drove the 7 miles to Carancas. The small village, nestled in the shadows of snow-capped mountains, was eerily quiet and deserted. As the mayor slowly drove through the narrow and winding streets, he could see people peering out their windows. Normally, they'd come outside to wave hello, but now it seemed like they were terrified of leaving their homes. A few minutes later, Trujillo pulled up to a small adobe house with a thatched roof. It belonged to the local shaman, a man the mayor had long respected for his wisdom. Everybody in town trusted the shaman, and Trujillo hoped he could bring some calm to the community. Trujillo stepped out of his car, and he was pleased to see that the shaman came out of his house to greet him. Trujillo explained the situation to the shaman, and the shaman nodded thoughtfully, and he agreed that the meteorite was not a curse, although it had disrupted balance in the land. And so he said he was happy to do his part to restore the natural order of things. Trujillo smiled and shook the shaman's hand. He promised he'd be in touch soon, and then Mayor Trujillo headed back to his car. With the shaman's help, he was sure he could get the townspeople to listen to him and restore order in the town. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away in Montreal, Canada, a professor named Peter Schultz was standing in line at a coffee shop scrolling through the news app on his phone. He taught Earth, Environmental, and Planetary Sciences at Brown University in Rhode Island, but he was in Montreal for a conference on craters made by meteorites and other space objects. He was fascinated by the articles about the meteorite strike in southern Peru, and not just because he found meteorites in general interesting. This one stuck out because it made no sense. The reports said that Carancas was struck by a chondrite meteorite, the most common type of meteorite, but also the most fragile. A chondrite meteorite is a type of rock that comes from asteroids. They're made up of small grains of minerals that have not been melted or changed much since they formed billions of years ago. Chondrites are so porous that they crack and burn up in Earth's atmosphere before they can hit the ground. To Peter, it seemed impossible that one of these chondrite meteorites could hit the Earth with enough force to create this massive crater. Stranger still, he had read that more than 200 people who visited the crash site had ended up in the hospital. Meteorites should not be making people sick. Peter thought there had to be more to the story than met the eye. Peter turned his phone to silent and spent the rest of the afternoon in back-to-back lectures at his conference. He finally left around dusk. As he walked to dinner, he noticed his voicemail was full of inquiries from different reporters and news outlets, hoping for a comment from him on how a meteorite could cause such a widespread sickness. But Peter had to tell these reporters the truth. He did not have answers, but he wanted to get them, and the only way to do it was to head to Peru and see the crater for himself. A few days later, Mayor Trujillo stood in the very crowded community center in Desaguadero. He had needed a huge space to hold this town hall meeting, and Carancas didn't really have a building that could accommodate this size crowd. Even this community center was packed with almost every single person from Carancas in attendance. The mayor shivered, but not because he was cold. He knew that the government scientists had discovered something that would have a profound impact on everyone in this area, and not just for those who had gotten sick at the crater. As Trujillo stood there waiting, he spotted Gregorio Yaruri sitting in the back. He was grateful to him for his role in alerting the authorities, and was happy to see that Gregorio looked healthy. In fact, most of the locals who'd gotten sick were starting to feel better. But Trujillo knew if they didn't listen to the scientists, then things could get worse again. Trujillo had invited 2 guests to this meeting. One was the local shaman, and the other was a geologist named Luisa Macedo. She was one of the scientists flown in by the government. The mayor made his way to the front of the crowd and called for silence. He had to choose his words carefully to avoid panicking those who believed that Carancas was actually cursed. He cleared his throat and announced that, yes, something had fallen from the sky, but it had been a meteorite from outer space. Before anyone could argue with him, he called the shaman over to join him and asked if he could prepare a sacrifice. It needed to be something that would appease the spirits in case they were the ones who sent the meteorite crashing to Earth. The shaman nodded. He told the crowd that they had rightfully sensed that the meteorite had unbalanced the land, but he reassured them that the correct sacrifice would help appease any unhappy spirits. He promised he would sacrifice a llama fetus at the crater as soon as possible, which should be enough to restore harmony to the area. Several of the older women present smiled, but Mayor Trujillo was still tense. Now came the hard part, getting them to accept the scientists' findings without panicking. He introduced Luisa, the government geologist. The hall erupted in whispers. Trujillo told the villagers to calm down, that Luisa was from southern Peru just like they were. That's why he'd asked her to speak. Everyone seemed to accept this, since a regional scientist seemed a little more trustworthy. The crowd settled down a bit, and then Luisa smiled and she held up a large cardboard chart she'd made showing data on the local water table. Trujillo held his breath, worried she was making things more complicated. Instead, the crowd pushed in to get a better look at what she had. Luisa explained that she and her team weren't totally sure what was making so many people and livestock sick, but they had a strong theory. The day that she and her team had arrived in town, they'd gone to the crash site and collected samples from different parts of the area. They also tested the groundwater at the bottom of the crater. Mayor Trujillo saw Luisa hesitate for a moment and then continue. She said that her team found that the water contained dangerous levels of arsenic, a deadly poison. The crowd erupted in murmurs of alarm. As Trujillo looked around the room, he wasn't surprised by everyone's reaction. When he first heard Luisa's theory, he'd been stunned too. But he needed the crowd to listen. Their lives depended on what Luisa had to say. Trujillo raised his hands and called for order, and after a few seconds, the townspeople did quiet down, and he told them to continue to listen to Luisa. Luisa nodded, and then explained that when the meteorite hit Carancas, the shockwave caused the groundwater to heat up and vaporize. This caused the air to fill with a fine mist of arsenic vapor. Everyone who had gone to see the crater got sick because they had inhaled that vapor. After hearing what she had to say, the crowd became agitated again and started shouting questions. Mayor Trujillo saw Gregorio in the back, trying to be heard, and so Trujillo demanded everyone be quiet, and he pointed at Gregorio and asked him to speak. Gregorio, the sheep farmer, stood up and politely asked Luisa if that meant their drinking water was contaminated too. Luisa stayed silent for a moment. Trujillo could tell she was carefully thinking about what to say next. Finally, she nodded and said that although they did need to do more testing, it was very likely. In fact, most likely, their water supply had been contaminated for years, making the people less healthy and more vulnerable to deadly diseases like cancer, heart disease, and diabetes. And so until they knew for sure, Luisa advised the crowd to just drink bottled water. Gregorio was alarmed by what he heard, but he thanked her and sat down. Everyone else seemed totally stunned into silence by Luisa's explanation. First the meteor hit, making people sick. Now they learned their water was contaminated all along. Trujillo knew it was frightening, but at least they knew what they were dealing with. After answering more questions, Luisa wrapped up her remarks and walked off the stage. But as she headed toward him, Mayor Trujillo noticed that the scientist looked anxious. He pulled her aside and asked if everything was okay. Luisa shook her head and told him that something still didn't make sense. She was confident that the sickness had been caused by arsenic gas from the meteorite impact, but she had not actually proven that. No scientists had detected arsenic in the air around the crater. That was a theory. In fact, she didn't understand how the meteorite could have gotten hot enough to create this toxic arsenic vapor. Luisa explained that meteorites are usually freezing when they impact Earth, even though they may look like they're on fire. That's because space is extremely cold, with an average temperature of negative 454 degrees Fahrenheit. The friction caused by entering Earth's atmosphere would have heated it up a little bit, but not enough to boil water and turn it into a mist. Mayor Trujillo frowned. He now realized that even Luisa wasn't sure that her arsenic theory was right. And if she was wrong, then something else had made his people sick. Trujillo was troubled. But he had a more immediate challenge, making sure the local drinking water was safe. It was up to the scientists to figure out whether arsenic vapor or something else had caused the mass sickness. Until they figured it out, Trujillo knew he would not sleep well. A little over 2 months later, in December of 2007, Professor Peter Schultz arrived in Carancas to investigate the crash site. On a dry and sunny day, he drove through the winding roads of the rugged countryside until he reached the crater. Even though the rainy season had nearly filled it with water, he was struck by how massive it was. Peter had heard about Luisa Macedo's discovery of arsenic in the water. There was no debate that there was arsenic in the water itself, but so far, nobody had been able to explain how, or even if, arsenic got into the air. Until that was proven, there was still the possibility that some other chemical from the meteorite's impact had made everyone sick. If that was the case, the people of Carancas could still be in danger. Peter was determined to find the answer and make sure these people were safe. And over the next few weeks, he was able to slowly form a theory that connected all the dots. Usually, when chondrite meteorites shoot through the Earth's atmosphere, their fragile makeup causes them to shatter into hundreds of tiny pieces, which turn to ash long before they ever reach the Earth's surface. And that's what should have happened with this meteorite. Peter concluded that the Carancas meteorite survived its passage through the atmosphere because of its high speed and shallow entry angle. He believed that these factors, along with the heat from the Earth's atmosphere, caused the outer layers of the meteorite to melt and fuse back together. That made it dense enough to make it through the atmosphere, where it became superheated and unleashed the arsenic vapor once it hit the ground. All this meant that the people of Carancas were safe. It was the meteorite and not some other unidentified danger that heated up the arsenic-laced water and turned it into vapor. Thankfully, the damage caused by the meteorite's impact was not permanent. All the people who'd gotten sick, including Gregorio Yaruri, made a full recovery, and so did all the animals. Thanks to the research of Luisa Macedo and the other scientists, arsenic was detected in the drinking water, and nonprofit organizations have installed measures to make it safer. Even though the water is cleaner and the arsenic gas is long gone, the people of Carancas will always remember when, in a way, they were attacked by a UFO. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, in the summer of 1983, a middle-aged Italian man held his mother's hands as they swayed about on a dance floor. His mother was in her 90s and was not able to get out very much, so this was an extremely special occasion. And this particular dance floor was on a cruise ship sailing on the Mediterranean Sea. It was an unbelievable experience he knew they would never forget. Then a slow song came on, and as they danced together, the man began to feel abnormally hot. Sweat ran down his chest and underneath his tuxedo jacket, his hair stuck to his neck, and when he touched his forehead, his hand came away wet. He told his mother he'd be right back, and then he left the dance floor, took off his jacket, and walked to the cruise deck, hoping the ocean breeze would cool him down. But when he got up there, he didn't cool down, and instead he just kept on sweating until his dress shirt was completely drenched. The man finally just ran to a bathroom in one of the cruise ship's long hallways, and he ran right over to the sink, turned on the cold water, and splashed it on his face. But when he looked up at his reflection, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Not because of how much he was sweating, but because when he looked at his eyes, he could see his pupils had shrunk to 2 tiny pinpricks. Suddenly, he knew exactly what was wrong. He stared at his sweaty reflection and told himself he would go back out there on the dance floor and he would enjoy this night with his mother. He had to make every second count, because he was certain he'd be dead within a year. On a spring evening in 1978, a 48-year-old man named Silvano walked through the doors of a grand Italian palazzo. Silvano was in this big, gorgeous house to celebrate someone's birthday, though he wasn't exactly sure whose birthday it was. This wasn't unusual for Silvano. He came from one of the most prominent families in the Veneto region, so his calendar was often packed with all kinds of galas and parties and charity events. And he never passed up an opportunity to slick back his bright red hair and dress in his favorite tuxedo. As Silvano made his way to the bar, he noticed people looking at him and whispering to each other. He tried not to pay any mind to it. Everyone in his family was the subject of gossip and rumors. It was something he'd grown up with his entire life. So Silvano ignored the chatter while he got his drink and then went to join some friends. While they talked, he caught the eye of a beautiful woman across the room. And instead of turning away or whispering to her friends, the woman smiled. Silvano smiled back. He'd always had a lot of success with dating, and he loved the bachelor lifestyle. So he excused himself from his friends and began walking in the woman's direction. But before he reached her, somebody grabbed his arm. Silvano turned to see who it was, and he saw it was his niece's husband, Ignazio. And he was out of breath, his hair was a mess, and his clothes were totally disheveled, and he told Silvano that something was terribly wrong with Silvano's sister. Silvano kept a calm expression on his face, but inside he was panicking because he knew exactly what was wrong with his sister. He told Ignazio to bring him to his sister right away, and the two men hurried off out of the party. About half an hour later, Silvano was by his sister's bedside, and she was curled up in her pajamas, totally drenched in sweat. Silvano bent down to ask how she was feeling, and when she turned to look at him, her pupils were so small he could barely see them. She stared in his direction for a moment, and then just shook her head. Tears slowly filled Silvano's eyes. He knew what that look meant. His sister had been struck by the family curse. A few months later, in early 1979, Silvano and the rest of his family stood at his sister's grave for her funeral. His mother gripped his arm, sobbing into his chest, while the priest performed the eulogy. Silvano was stricken with grief as well, but now his eyes were dry. He felt like he'd been mourning his sister ever since that night when he found out she was sick. He just didn't have any more tears to cry. He held tightly onto his mother, doing his best to offer her comfort. He whispered to her that there was nothing anyone could have done. After all, nobody survives the family curse. At this, Silvano's mother snapped her head up, glaring at him with red-rimmed eyes. She hissed at him to never speak of that again. Otherwise, he, Silvano, could be struck by this curse that had just killed his sister and had killed his father, his grandfather, and countless other relatives dating all the way back to the 1700s. Silvano apologized and his mother nodded, and then she nestled her head back into his chest. Silvano spent the rest of the funeral in stoic silence. As his sister's casket was lowered into the ground, Silvano couldn't help picturing what his own funeral would look like when this curse inevitably killed him. After his sister died, Silvano threw himself completely into his work. He managed a very successful construction company and spent all his time organizing projects and visiting job sites. One of his remaining living sisters, who lived with Silvano, had to constantly remind him to eat and drink, and then whenever he had a social event, she had to remind him to attend it. For the next few years, that was what Silvano's life was like. Basically work 24/7. But by 1983, 4 years after his sister had died, Silvano was completely exhausted. He knew he needed a break. So that summer, he decided to surprise his mother with a cruise on the Mediterranean Sea. And it would turn out it would be just what he needed. The warm air was invigorating, and every evening there was a new party for Silvano to attend. But on the last night of the cruise, disaster struck. Silvano was dancing with his mother when he suddenly felt overheated. He could feel his skin sticking to the shirt underneath his tuxedo jacket. His mother pulled away from him and asked if he was okay, and Silvano nodded and said he was fine, he just needed to go cool off for a minute. Silvano's pulse raced as he ran to the bathroom. He knew this was not just a simple case of overexerting himself, and when he looked into the mirror, his pinprick-sized pupils confirmed his worst fear. The family curse had indeed come for him too, and he was all too familiar with what happened next. First, he would stop being able to sleep, his mind would begin to deteriorate, and he'd lose his grip on reality, and then shortly after that, he'd be dead. And there was nothing anyone could do about it. After the cruise was over, Silvano considered telling his mother and sister that he very likely had been afflicted by the family curse, but ultimately he decided against it. There was nothing they could do to stop this curse from killing him, and so he just didn't want them to worry. But it was very difficult for Silvano to hide his symptoms from his family, especially his sister who lived with him. He kept having to change clothes because he sweated through them so quickly. He rarely made eye contact with her because he didn't want her to see his pupils, and at night when he laid in bed unable to sleep, he was too scared to get out of his bed and do anything because he was worried his sister would hear him walking around. About 6 months after the cruise, Silvano sat at his desk in his home office. He'd been avoiding going to work in person because he didn't want anyone to notice his illness. The clock read 3 p.m., but Silvano had already put in a long day because he had been up working since 4 o'clock that morning. Even though he'd been working for 11 hours straight, Silvano did not feel tired. He just felt hot. He grabbed a piece of paper off his desk and used it to fan himself. Silvano knew the curse was only going to get worse, but there really wasn't anything he could do to stop it. So he figured, why worry about it? He didn't even call a doctor. He'd rather keep trying to live his life than cry over something he couldn't change. Just then, Silvano's sister rounded the corner into his office. He immediately dropped the paper, hoping she had not noticed him fanning himself, and she asked if he was going to take a break to eat. But he told her he was just too busy. She stood there staring at him. He could tell she didn't believe him. Finally, she sighed and left the room. For a second, Silvano thought about getting up and following her down the hall and letting her in on his declining health, but before he could, his phone rang, so he answered it. It was his niece's husband, Ignacio. He asked Silvano if he'd come over for dinner that evening. Silvano didn't have any other plans, so he said sure. Silvano hung up the phone and pushed the stack of papers aside and then stood up. He'd already sweat through all of his clothes, so he'd need to shower and change. He quietly opened his office door and tiptoed to his bedroom, being extra careful not to make any noise, in fear that his sister might come find him and see his drenched clothing. Silvano hated having to sneak through the house, but he didn't know what else to do. He promised himself that he would tell his sister what was going on as soon as he could find the right words. That evening, Silvano arrived at Ignacio and his niece Elisabeta's house with his red hair neatly brushed and a pocket square tucked into his suit. Silvano shook Ignacio's hand and gave Elisabeta a hug. He kept a smile on his face, but as he did, he worried they would see how sweaty he already was. As they led him down the hallway to the kitchen, Silvano caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror, and he looked terrible. He'd done everything he could to clean up, but there was just no hiding the sweat on his brow or the dark circles under his eyes or his tiny, tiny pupils. Silvano looked away from his reflection and took a seat at the table. Ignacio filled 3 glasses with red wine, and Elisabeta brought a large dinner salad to the table. Silvano had barely taken 1 bite before Ignacio made him wish he had not come over at all. Ignacio asked Silvano how he'd been sleeping. Silvano knew exactly what that meant. Either he had not hidden his symptoms well enough, or maybe his sister, who lived with him, maybe she noticed the curse was creeping up on him and told the family. Silvano sipped his wine and admitted he had not been sleeping much, but it was okay. He was using the extra time to get more work done. The only thing that bothered him was that his sex drive had disappeared. He said that to be funny, but Ignacio and Elisabeta did not laugh. Ignacio's expression was grave. He said he'd gotten access to the local parish records, which contained information about the family going back to the 18th century. He discovered that throughout the generations, Silvano's ancestors had frequently died young, and the records said they died from all kinds of strange disorders and diseases. Things like epilepsy, fever, meningitis, dementia, various brain diseases, and schizophrenia. As for the death of Silvano's sister, that had been attributed to familial encephalitis, which is a type of brain disease. But Ignacio said he didn't think any of those things were actually the thing that killed them. He was certain they had all died from the family curse. But of course, family curse would not be an acceptable cause of death. Even in the 1700s, they would not put that down as the thing that killed someone. Ignacio believed the real disease that was wiping out members of this family was some kind of rare genetic condition originating in the brain, one that nobody had ever been able to identify. He begged Silvano to please seek help from a neurologist before it was too late. Silvano leaned back and crossed his arms. He felt betrayed, like this dinner had been a setup just to ambush him. He told Ignacio he didn't want help. He'd seen his sisters poked and prodded by doctors before invariably they still just passed away. Going to a neurologist would only cause more pain and more frustration. But Ignacio would not take no for an answer. He said he knew a neurologist in a nearby town, it'd be a quick visit, and if nothing else, the doctor might be able to prescribe something that could help Silvano sleep even a little bit. Silvano shrugged and then finished his wine in a single gulp, and then he said, "Okay, fine, I'll go, but only if you don't ask me to do anything else after this." The next evening, Ignacio was in his bed with his wife when his phone rang. He pushed the covers back and walked to the receiver, and when he picked it up, he heard Silvano's sister's frantic voice on the other end. She told Ignacio to come over quickly, then the line went dead. Ignacio figured this must have something to do with Silvano and the family curse, so he rushed to his car and sped over to his uncle-in-law's house. When he got there, he flung open the door and raced inside. Silvano's sister was right inside the house in the entryway, and her eyes were wide as she watched her brother, Silvano, who was right across from her at the base of the stairs. Silvano wore black silk pajamas that were totally drenched in sweat, and he was hunched over slightly, moving his arms like he was trying to pick up objects and move them, except his hands were empty. It was like he wasn't even aware of what he was doing or aware of anyone else in the room. Silvano's sister whispered to Ignacio that she'd heard a commotion in Silvano's room, and when she went to investigate, she saw Silvano sitting up in bed doing this weird military-style salute. And then without a word, he'd just gotten up, walked right past her, and marched down the stairs. And so Silvano's sister had no idea what was happening or what to do. Ignacio reassured her that probably Silvano was just sleepwalking and so was not in any sort of danger. Then Ignacio walked over to his uncle-in-law and he kind of shook his shoulder, at which point Silvano woke up, acted very confused, and then said he'd been dreaming about packing a suitcase. Ignacio glanced from Silvano to Silvano's sister, and then he told both of them that, it seems like the sedative Silvano is taking is probably leading to sleepwalking. And so because sleepwalking can be quite hazardous, it's probably best that Silvano stop taking the sedative. Ignacio was naturally very worried about Silvano. Even though the first neurologist really had not worked out at all, Ignacio felt even more determined to find someone who could maybe help Silvano get better. But while Ignacio looked for another doctor, Silvano's symptoms just got worse and worse. He had not been sleeping well for months, and the exhaustion was totally getting to him. In March of 1984, so about a month after the sleepwalking episode, Silvano tried to go into the office to work. He wore cool, comfortable clothing and acted like everything was perfectly normal. But when one of his employees asked him a very simple question, it was like Silvano's brain couldn't process it, and so he literally couldn't answer. And then later, when Silvano tried to just write his name on a document, his hands were so shaky that his signature looked totally wrong. And a few times he tried to speak to his colleagues, and the words came out slurred and totally incoherent. Silvano knew he could not continue to work like this. As much as he wanted to cling to his normal life, he knew his normal life was over. So he walked into his boss's office and quit his job. As he packed up his belongings, Silvano had to face the facts. He was dying. It was heartbreaking and infuriating to know that he would succumb to the same illness that had been killing his family for centuries. But Silvano had changed his mind about one thing. He knew he was going to die, but he didn't just want to wait for death. Instead, he wanted to do everything he could to try to learn about his illness, and so that maybe he could prevent other family members from getting this family curse. Silvano hated the idea of seeing another doctor, but now he needed one. He went home that afternoon and called Ignacio, and to Silvano's relief, Ignacio said he'd actually already found the perfect neurologist. The next morning, a renowned sleep expert named Dr. Elio Lugarezzi welcomed Ignazio and Silvano to the University of Bologna's Neurological Institute in the bustling city of Bologna, Italy. Dr. Lugarezzi greeted Ignazio and then went to shake Silvano's hand, but Silvano for a second just stood there staring blankly like he didn't understand what was going on, and then suddenly he kind of snapped out of it and reached out and shook the doctor's hand. After that, Dr. Lugarezzi led the men down a long decorated hallway into his office. The doctor sat at a large organized desk and motioned for Ignazio and Silvano to take the seats across from him. Then, once they were seated, he asked Silvano what was going on. In an eerily calm and quiet voice, Silvano said he was going to die, and he knew exactly how it was going to happen. Currently, he said he was having trouble sleeping, but he was still getting maybe 2 or 3 hours of rest every night. But eventually he knew he would stop sleeping altogether, and then he would develop hallucinations, and then eventually the exhaustion would kill him. Ignazio leaned forward and explained that Silvano's illness actually ran in his family. 2 of Silvano's sisters had died from this condition, so had his father, grandfather, and various ancestors going back more than 2 centuries. Dr. Lugarezzi eyed Silvano carefully. He'd been studying sleep for over 20 years, and he'd never heard of any condition like this. But Dr. Lugarezzi was very confident in his abilities as a sleep specialist, and so he assured Silvano they could find a treatment. But Silvano just shook his head and said there really was no treatment. However, even though he knew he was doomed, he wanted to try to help his family as best as he could. And so he asked Dr. Lugarezzi to please study him until he died, and then after he died, take his brain and study it and try to figure out what this curse really is. Dr. Lugarezzi stared at Silvano and then glanced over at Ignazio, who looked just as desperate as Silvano, and then the neurologist just nodded. He told Silvano to go home, pack up everything he needed to live at the Neurological Institute, and then come back that evening. And then, after Silvano and Ignazio left, Dr. Lugarezzi and his team set up the laboratory observation room where Silvano would live. The room was small and nondescript, and had a bed in one corner and a video camera in the other. The video camera would allow doctors to record Silvano's every move. Hopefully, this would allow them to figure out what Silvano's illness really was, and who knows, maybe they might even be able to cure him. Silvano returned that evening wearing his black silk pajamas and carrying a suitcase that contained clothes and toiletries. As he stared at the building in front of him, he realized this was the place he was almost certainly going to die. Dr. Lugarezzi met Silvano at the door and led him back to the observation room where he'd be staying. Silvano sat at the edge of the bed while a team of neurologists hooked him up to all kinds of monitors. A sensor around his arm measured his blood pressure, a thin band on his other arm kept track of his body temperature, a piece of plastic clamped onto his finger counted his pulse. Lastly, Dr. Lugarezzi pulled out this sort of tight, stretchy hat and told Silvano to put it on. It looked kind of like a swim cap, except it was covered in small black circular sensors and cords. Silvano pulled it on, and 2 flaps of fabric hung down on either side of his face. As Dr. Lugarezzi velcroed the fabric together beneath Silvano's chin, he explained that Silvano was wearing an electrode sensor cap. It was there to track and record electrical signals in Silvano's brain, which would hopefully give Dr. Lugarezzi some insight into why he couldn't sleep. Silvano figured he looked absolutely ridiculous, but now was not the time to be concerned with his appearance. He was doing this to help his family. Dr. Lugarezzi told Silvano he would be constantly watching him and monitoring his vital signs. Then he turned and left, and Silvano was all alone in his new bedroom. Silvano laid down and closed his eyes. The oxygen monitor dug into his finger, and the electrode sensor cap pressed into the back of his head. He couldn't get comfortable, especially when he knew a camera was watching him. But it didn't really matter. Whether Silvano was here or at home, he didn't think he was going to get any sleep. So he laid on the bed and stared up at the tile ceiling. But the longer he looked, the fuzzier his vision got. And then the seemingly random patterns on the ceiling tiles started to morph and shift into shapes and faces. Silvano knew he was hallucinating, which came with the family curse, but he couldn't do anything about it, so he decided he would just enjoy the show. From outside the room, Dr. Lugarezzi watched a screen that showed data from Silvano's monitors. On the screen, a series of lines spiked, dipped, and flattened out, depending on the electrical signals in Silvano's brain. Dr. Lugarezzi watched the screen getting more and more confused. The data from Silvano's brain did not look like anything he had ever seen before. People typically had one electrical pattern when they were awake and another quite different pattern when they were sleeping. But Silvano's results didn't match either of them. He was in some kind of in-between state, not awake, but not asleep. Dr. Lugaresi watched through the window as Silvano moved his arms up and down over his head. It looked like he was going through the motions of combing his hair, except his hands were empty and his head was totally covered in wires. Whatever was going on, it was not typical sleepwalking. Silvano would eventually fall asleep, but only for an hour. When he woke up, Dr. Lugaresi checked his various monitors. Silvano's body temperature was abnormally high, his breathing was irregular, and his heart rate was erratic. Dr. Lugaresi glanced at his colleagues, and they looked just as confused as he felt. Dr. Lugaresi didn't know what any of these symptoms meant or how they might be related. He realized that solving this mystery might be a lot harder than he'd anticipated. One morning, about a month into his stay at the Neurological Institute, Silvano sat upright in bed, staring into space. Over the past few weeks, his mind had begun to deteriorate. He spent almost all of his time in that in-between state where he wasn't quite sleeping or quite awake. Without regular sleep, every day kind of bled into the next one, and so Silvano lost track of time. He would look around the hospital room to try to ground himself to figure out what was going on, but he couldn't get his eyes to focus. Sometimes Silvano was vaguely aware of Dr. Lugaresi asking him some questions, but the doctor's voice sounded garbled and far away. That morning, as he sat awake staring at nothing, Silvano actually started to feel tired. And just as he thought he was finally going to get a little bit of sleep, his head just jerked right back up. And then he felt tired, and so he started to drift off, but then again, his head snapped back up. It was like his body was actively rejecting sleep. Frustrated, Silvano pushed himself out of bed with his weak, shaky arms, and then he just began shuffling around the room with no idea where he was trying to go or what he was trying to do. It took all of his strength to put one foot in front of the other, but it was better than trying to sleep unsuccessfully. As Dr. Lugaresi watched Silvano pace around in his room, the doctor decided he had to do something to help. He went into the room and gently led Silvano back over to his bed, and then once he was sitting down, he injected him with a sedative. And as soon as he did, Silvano's pulse and blood pressure plummeted. He almost stopped breathing. Dr. Lugaresi's stomach dropped. The sedatives had sent Silvano into a coma. Panicked, he administered more medications to undo the effect of the sedative, and these medications did bring Silvano out of the coma and put him back into that kind of trance-like state he was in. Dr. Lugaresi didn't know what to do. Silvano had always told him that there was no cure for this family curse, but Dr. Lugaresi had really wanted to prove him wrong. But now, after a month of monitoring Silvano, the doctor still could not give him a proper diagnosis, let alone help him get better. Dr. Lugaresi was really starting to feel helpless. Another month later, Dr. Lugaresi sat next to Silvano's bedside. Silvano was practically comatose, a totally blank expression on his face, until out of nowhere, he wrapped his arms around his legs and started screaming as loud as he could. To Dr. Lugaresi, it was like all of Silvano's pent-up pain and frustration was now finally just coming out. The worst part was, this seemed to be the last bit of energy left in Silvano. Over the next few weeks, Dr. Lugaresi watched as Silvano became less and less aware of the world around him. He quit eating, he quit moving, and so Dr. Lugaresi knew Silvano was dying, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Silvano passed away in the laboratory observation room. Just as he'd predicted, he died 9 months after that night on the cruise ship when he first noticed symptoms of the family curse developing. Dr. Lugaresi kept the promise he'd made to Silvano. Immediately after he died, a pathologist removed Silvano's brain, and it was shipped to a neurological specialist in America. And what that specialist discovered in Silvano's brain shocked Dr. Lugaresi. The thalamus is a small walnut-shaped structure located near the center of the brain. It helps us process sensory information and plays a vital role in consciousness and maintaining our regular sleeping and waking cycles. And Silvano's thalamus was full of holes. It literally looked like worms had just bored right through it. Large portions of his thalamus had just been totally destroyed.
Dr. Lugaresi had never seen anything like this before. In fact, this was a new disease, and it would be named fatal familial insomnia. In 1986, Dr. Lugaresi published his findings, detailing Silvano's illness and introducing his family's curse to the scientific community. Based on further research with Silvano's relatives, Dr. Lugaresi eventually determined fatal familial insomnia is caused by malfunctioning proteins which attack the thalamus. As the thalamus is destroyed, the brain loses the ability to regulate the body and the mind. This leads to total insomnia, like literally they cannot sleep anymore, which eventually causes death. The chances of the average person developing fatal insomnia are about 1 in a million. But in Silvano's family, where the disease had been passed down genetically through generations, the chances were 1 in 2. In 1986, Silvano and his relatives were the only known people suffering from fatal familial insomnia in the world. In the years since, researchers have found about 50 other families with the same disorder. There are currently no effective treatments for fatal familial insomnia. It's a death sentence. But doctors do still continue to research the disease in hopes of someday finding a cure.
The emergency room physician raced to his patient's bedside and jammed a long, hollow tube down the unconscious man's throat. He fed the tube down the man's esophagus, down into his stomach. Once it was in place, he attached a large syringe full of water to the tube. He depressed the plunger on the syringe, forcing the water down the tube and into the man's stomach. Then, the doctor slowly retracted the plunger on the syringe, creating suction. Fluid immediately emptied out of the man's stomach and back into the syringe. The doctor dumped that fluid into a bucket beside the bed and then repeated that process over and over again until he was certain that every ounce of food had been emptied from the man's stomach. The doctor hoped that, along with the liquid and bile, came whatever poison had made this old man sick in the first place. The poison that caused this man to collapse on the sidewalk, gasping for air as his skin turned a bright sky blue. Before 8 a.m. on the morning of September 25, 1944, a police officer patrolled Day Street in Lower Manhattan in New York City. He passed the usual morning bustle, factory workers leaving the subway, telephone operators on their way to the nearby telephone and telegraph building, a food truck unloading vegetables at a dingy corner market, and someone begging for change outside an abandoned warehouse. Then, the officer noticed what looked like a heap of clothing just lying on the sidewalk ahead of him. The officer sighed and shook his head. He hated litter and took a lot of pride in keeping his streets clean. So the officer approached this pile of clothes, looking for a trash can to dump it in. But as he got closer, the officer realized this pile of clothes was actually an elderly man in a shabby overcoat. He was doubled over and clutching his stomach. The officer felt annoyed as the smell of stale alcohol and body odor rose from the old man's coat. He figured this man was just drunk after a long night out. So the officer bent down and shook the man's shoulder, asking if he was okay. Then, without warning, the old man turned over and vomited onto the sidewalk. The officer jumped back to avoid getting puke on his shoes. This old man was clearly very drunk and so could not be left on the streets alone. The officer had no choice but to arrest him for public intoxication. But as the officer reached for his handcuffs, he stopped because he noticed something very odd about this old man. His nose, lips, ears, and fingers were all as blue as the sky above. It was so strange that it took a moment for the officer to register what he was even seeing. Then, between this guy's blue skin, the glazed-over look on his face, and the vomit on the sidewalk, it clicked. This was not public intoxication, this was a medical emergency. So the officer ran to a payphone and called dispatch and requested an ambulance. Luckily, there was an emergency room close by at Beekman Downtown Hospital. The hospital was only 6 blocks away, so an ambulance arrived in just a matter of minutes. The officer helped one of the emergency responders hoist the old man off the sidewalk and onto a stretcher, and then they loaded him into the back of the ambulance. The officer took a step back as the ambulance driver closed the door and then sped away.
After the ambulance had disappeared around the corner and the police officer had resumed his beat, he thought to himself, in all his years on the force, that might have been the strangest thing he'd ever come across. A few minutes later, an attending physician named Dr. Francis Stevens ran outside of Beekman Downtown Hospital. He'd been notified about the incoming patient with the sky blue skin, and now he was rushing to meet the ambulance, pulling up out in front. Dr. Stevens helped the ambulance driver pull out a stretcher, and then using it, they carried the old man inside. The driver explained that although the old man had been awake when he was loaded into the ambulance, he had lost consciousness during the short drive to the hospital. Dr. Stevens nodded, guessing that his new patient had likely passed out from shock. He could tell from the man's skin color alone that his heart must not be pumping enough blood through his body, which meant he was at risk of a heart attack. As they transferred the old man from his stretcher to an actual hospital bed, Dr. Stevens saw that nearly half of this man's body had turned blue. Dr. Stevens jumped into action. They only had minutes to supply the old man's body with oxygen and then get his heart to pump it through his bloodstream. Without immediate treatment, this man would die. Dr. Stevens figured that the old man must have ingested something that made him this sick, so he raced to pump the man's stomach until he was sure it was empty. This meant that whatever had made him sick hopefully would not be able to do any more damage. The doctor then strapped an oxygen mask over the old man's face to increase the oxygen in his blood and then gave him stimulants to help his heart pump more efficiently. After this, there was nothing to do but wait. Dr. Stevens looked at the old man lying unconscious in the bed, his skin still bright blue, and the doctor just hoped they had treated him in time to save his life. Later that morning, Dr. Stevens returned to check on the old man and found him lying in bed, fully awake. His lips and fingertips did have a bluish tinge still, but the effect clearly had dramatically lessened. The man said his name was William and that he was 82 years old, and then after that he began looking around the room with very suspicious eyes and demanded to know what had happened to him. Dr. Stevens told William that he had been suffering from a condition known as cyanosis that results from inadequate oxygen in the bloodstream. Cyanosis is known for causing people's skin to turn blue. It was a rare condition, and they weren't sure why William had gotten it. Although Dr. Stevens could assure William that for the time being, the best treatment available was just to rest. This answer did not seem to satisfy William because his next question was, well, when do I get to go home? But before Dr. Stevens could answer him, the doors of the emergency room burst open and another unconscious man was carried into the waiting room. Dr. Stevens rushed from William's side to help this new patient. As the man was laid onto a bed, Dr. Stevens stopped and just stared at him with a look of surprise on his face. This new patient was also an old man dressed in tattered clothes, and as Dr. Stevens bent over him, he noticed that, just like William, this old man's lips, nose, and fingers were also bright blue. So Dr. Stevens administered the same treatment he'd just given William: a stomach pump, an oxygen mask, and heart stimulants. But as he was working on this new patient, Dr. Stevens started to have this sinking feeling in his gut. 2 cyanosis cases on the same day? What was that about? He knew that in rare cases, cyanosis was a symptom of carbon monoxide poisoning. He worried that there might be a gas leak in a nearby building, and in a neighborhood as crowded as Lower Manhattan, that could be disastrous. Dr. Stevens was able to stabilize this new patient's condition, but the doctor didn't have a moment to rest. Almost immediately after the second patient was stable, he heard another ambulance pull up out front, and seconds later, 3 more people were carried in. And from across the room, Dr. Stevens could already see that all 3 of them were elderly, run-down men, and they were all bright blue. Now, Beekman Downtown Hospital had a total of 5 cyanosis patients. Dr. Stevens and his staff worked through the entire morning to save these 3 new blue patients, and then just before lunch, 2 more blue men were carried in, and 10 minutes later, another 2. Dr. Stevens was totally confused. Something in the city had to be making all these men sick, but it just was not clear what it was. By noon, there were 9 ragged elderly men who had blue skin who were laid out in the hospital's beds. Dr. Stevens and his staff ran from bed to bed, administering treatment until all 9 men were totally stabilized and their skin was slowly turning back to its normal color. It was only then that Dr. Stevens had a moment to step back and actually go look at the men's admission papers. These documents revealed that all of the men had been found on sidewalks or in condemned buildings all around the neighborhood. Dr. Stevens didn't know what to make of this, but the fact that the men were coming from different places meant that a single gas leak probably could not have made them all sick. But if it wasn't gas poisoning, what was making these men turn blue? Dr. Stevens worried it could be some kind of airborne illness or virus, and so even though Dr. Stevens did not really know what was going on, he knew it was now time to report this outbreak to the Department of Health. About an hour later, a field epidemiologist with the New York Department of Health named Dr. Ottavio Pelletieri walked through the doors of Beekman Downtown Hospital. He showed his identification to the receptionist and asked to speak with the physician who was in charge. Dr. Pelletieri's job was to investigate possible outbreaks of disease. His eyes wandered around the emergency room. Of the 9 blue-skinned patients laying in the beds against the wall, only 5 of them were awake. Dr. Pelletieri focused on William, who was the first patient brought in that morning. William was sitting upright in his bed, his skin still somewhat blue, but he was clearly feeling better. Dr. Pelletieri walked over and introduced himself. He asked William about his morning. The old man coughed into his fist and then thought for a moment. He said at first it was just an ordinary day. He'd woken up in a nearby rooming house called the Globe Hotel, which was a crumbling, dingy building filled with as many twin beds as possible. After waking up, William said that he wandered down to breakfast at the Eclipse cafeteria, where low-income people could get a hot meal very cheap. He ate some oatmeal and drank some coffee, and then started back to his boarding house. And when he reached the sidewalk right outside of the Globe Hotel, he suddenly started feeling these stabbing pains inside of his stomach. Then he fell to the ground, and the next thing he knew, he was in this hospital bed. Just as Dr. Pelletieri was about to open his mouth to ask William some follow-up questions, the cyanosis patient in the next bed over piped up and said that he also had eaten at the Eclipse cafeteria that morning. Dr. Pelletieri raised his eyebrows. He stepped away from William's bed and asked the 5 conscious patients if they'd also eaten at Eclipse that morning. And all of them nodded yes, they had. Dr. Pelletieri now knew where to start his investigation. Something obviously was wrong at the Eclipse cafeteria. The question was whether there was a carbon monoxide leak there or if something else in the restaurant had made these men sick. It could be food poisoning, though Dr. Pelletieri thought this was unlikely since the symptoms of food poisoning usually take at least 12 hours to manifest, and these men had passed out from pain and shock within just minutes of leaving the Eclipse cafeteria. Dr. Pelletieri then thought of something else that could have caused this quick and sudden illness. He took another sweeping look at the 5 conscious men in front of him and told them he had one more question. He promised they would not be in trouble, but he just had to know whether any of them had used a drug such as heroin that morning. There was a pause as the men stared back at him, but then all of them shook their heads no, and then told Dr. Pelletieri that they were actually drinkers, not drug users. They were all so serious that Dr. Pelletieri immediately believed them. Just then, a nurse walked up behind Dr. Pelletieri and tapped him on the shoulder. She pointed across the room to Dr. Stevens, the ER doctor, who was striding toward him. Dr. Pelletieri gave Dr. Stevens a nod and met him halfway across the room, extending a handshake. After the men shook hands, Dr. Pelletieri explained that he would need blood samples from all 9 patients. They'd be sent to the city toxicologist for overnight testing. Dr. Stevens nodded and agreed to help. For the next 10 minutes, the 2 of them moved from patient to patient, collecting small vials of blood and labeling them carefully. By the time they were done, all but one of the cyanosis patients were awake. The only one who remained asleep was a man named John Marshall. He was laid out in the bed closest to the wall, fully unconscious, skin still pale blue. Dr. Pelletieri looked John up and down before labeling his blood and placing it in a small box with the other samples. It was clear to Dr. Pelletieri that whatever had made these men sick, John must have gotten the worst of it. Dr. Pelletieri grabbed his briefcase full of samples and then left the emergency room. He dropped the samples at his office for testing and then head straight to the Eclipse cafeteria. If he could figure out what had happened, there might still be time to save John's life.
I'm Alice Levine.
Afternoon, Dr. Pelletieri arrived at the Eclipse cafeteria to find it closed and locked up. But the lights were on inside, so the doctor knocked on the dingy glass door. When there was no answer, he knocked again, announcing himself loudly as a member of the health department. Finally, he saw someone inside pop out of the kitchen and hurry across the dining room. The man was dressed in a well-tailored trench coat and wore a suit. He unlocked the front door and opened it for Dr. Pelletieri, and then introduced himself as Mr. Weinberg and said he was from the New York Bureau of Food and Drugs. He explained to Dr. Pelletieri that a secretary from the New York Department of Health had already called his office. Now that a restaurant was potentially responsible for the cyanosis outbreak, his department needed to be involved. Dr. Pelletieri felt grateful for the unexpected help, and so he stepped inside of the Eclipse cafeteria, and right away he was hit with this horrible smell. It was like an algae-filled aquarium. Dr. Pelletieri thought there must be so much mold lurking behind all the filthy and cracked tile walls. This place was so overdue for a proper cleaning that an inch of black grit clung to every corner of the floor. Dr. Pelletieri looked around the rest of the room, and he saw fruit flies climbing the walls. There were 17 rickety tables that filled the dining room, each with its own sticky bottle of ketchup and salt and pepper shakers. Weinberg told Dr. Pelletieri that he had not found a gas leak anywhere inside, but he'd already cited the cafeteria with 15 separate health code violations. The kitchen was even more disgusting than the dining room. A thick layer of grease clung to every surface, bags of rotting garbage sat beneath the kitchen sinks. Dr. Pelletieri picked up a fork lying on the counter, and a thick layer of starch coated the fork prongs. To him, everything inside of this cafe was a potential contaminant. It was only then that Dr. Pelletieri noticed the cook and the restaurant owner standing beside the oven. Dr. Pelletieri was even more surprised to find that both men looked genuinely upset, maybe even afraid. Dr. Pelletieri felt relieved. Usually, restaurant owners were combative when the health department showed up, but he guessed that these men were going to be cooperative. If they had something to do with these 9 men getting sick, it seemed very much like it was an accident. Dr. Pelletieri wanted to speak with the line cook first. He asked the man if he did anything different than usual when he cooked breakfast that morning. The line cook shook his head and said no. He had made the usual breakfast of oatmeal, rolls, and coffee, nothing different than every other morning. Dr. Pelletieri then followed the cook to the pantry, taking note of the type of dry cereal the cook had used to make 6 gallons of oatmeal. Then the cook led Dr. Pelletieri to the giant metal stock pot that he had used to both cook the oatmeal and then serve the oatmeal, enough to serve 125 people that morning. The cook rattled off the recipe: 5 pounds of that dry cereal, 4 gallons of city tap water, and a handful of salt. The cook gestured to a gallon can of salt sitting on the stove, and then he pointed to a series of canisters sitting on a shelf just above the stove. The cook explained they stored the salt there in bulk, then just refilled the salt can on the stove as needed. Dr. Pelletieri said he wanted to take samples from everything the men had cooked with that morning. Then the doctor grabbed a step stool to reach the canisters labeled table salt above the oven. And when he was up there and was eye level with these canisters, he noticed there was a different canister hidden amongst them, one that did not have a label. Dr. Pelletieri lifted that can off the shelf and looked inside, and to him, it just looked like table salt. But just to be sure, Dr. Pelletieri climbed down from the stepladder and then showed this unlabeled can of white crystals to the cook and said, "What is this?" The cook explained that this can contained something known as saltpeter, which was a preservative he used to make corned beef and pastrami. The cook said he did not use the saltpeter to make oatmeal. For that, he used regular table salt. Dr. Pelletieri nodded, but just in case, he took a small sample of the saltpeter with him. For a moment, Dr. Pelletieri wondered if maybe there had been some kind of a mix-up and the cook had used saltpeter instead of table salt. But even if that had been the case, that would not have been what made all 9 of those men sick. Saltpeter was not toxic. Once Dr. Pelletieri had a bag full of all the samples he needed, he left the Eclipse cafeteria, hoping he would never have to return. Then he headed for the health department chemist's office. He needed these samples tested for poison overnight, along with the blood samples that he'd dropped off earlier. Dr. Pelletieri really wanted to get back to the hospital to check in on the 9 patients. But first, he had to make sure that this cyanosis outbreak was contained and that he was aware of every single cyanosis patient being treated right now in the city. He spent the next several hours visiting every cheap rooming house in the neighborhood, as well as all the nearby hospitals, until he was certain that the only cyanosis victims that were being dealt with right now were the 9 at the Beekman Downtown Hospital. When Dr. Pelletieri finally returned to the Beekman Downtown Hospital, it was well after midnight. And when he got there, a nurse greeted him and told him that since he had left the hospital that afternoon, 2 more elderly men had arrived with cyanosis, so blue skin. That brought the official count up to 11. Most of them were awake now and back to their normal coloring, but the sickest patient, John Marshall, still lay unconscious in his bed by the wall, and his situation seemed to only be getting worse. Dr. Pelletieri frowned and then thanked the nurse for the update. Then he headed back out the door toward his office to write his initial report, summarizing his investigation for his boss, Dr. Morris Greenberg, the city's chief epidemiologist. The next morning, Dr. Pelletieri had to go back to the Eclipse cafeteria, even though he really didn't want to. He was exhausted, having stayed up most of the night writing his report for his boss. But to continue his investigation, he would need to speak with more members of the kitchen staff. When he got there, the cafeteria was still closed because of the health department citations, but the busboys and cashiers were waiting for Dr. Pelletieri inside the dining room. He chatted with each of them, following them around the cafeteria as they pantomimed their workdays. It didn't take long for Dr. Pelletieri to conclude that their actions had not contributed to the cyanosis cases in any significant way. But as Dr. Pelletieri packed up his belongings and got ready to leave, the cook from the day before appeared in the dining room with a fearful look on his face. He admitted to Dr. Pelletieri that he'd been up all night worrying that maybe, just maybe, he did accidentally season the oatmeal with saltpeter, not table salt, and if so, he was incredibly sorry. Dr. Pelletieri clapped the man's shoulder and thanked him for the honesty, but assured him not to worry. Since saltpeter is edible, it would not have hurt anyone if he had made that mix-up. The cook visibly relaxed, and Dr. Pelletieri smiled and wished him a good afternoon. Within an hour, Dr. Pelletieri made it back to the Department of Health to find a note on his desk from his supervisor, Dr. Greenberg. The test results from all the Eclipse cafeteria food samples had come back, and Greenberg wanted to see Dr. Pelletieri immediately. Dr. Greenberg was sitting at his desk, looking over the results, when Dr. Pelletieri showed up and knocked on his doorframe. Greenberg looked up for a moment and waved Dr. Pelletieri in. And then once Dr. Pelletieri took a seat, Greenberg handed him a copy of the results. And as Dr. Pelletieri read the findings, his eyes went wide. The cook had, in fact, accidentally refilled the gallon can of salt on his stove with saltpeter instead of table salt. But that was not the issue. The problem was that both the table salt and the saltpeter contained measurable levels of sodium nitrite, a meat preservative that can be poisonous if not handled carefully. Dr. Pelletieri knew that sodium nitrite wasn't dangerous in small doses, but large quantities of it could be deadly. For a moment, Dr. Pelletieri wondered how sodium nitrite could have gotten into the kitchen in the first place. It was more common at processing plants where meats like salami, hot dogs, and bacon were cured. And then Dr. Pelletieri remembered that because the nation was in the middle of World War II, the government had approved the use of limited concentrations of sodium nitrite in restaurants to make foods last longer. The sodium nitrite had to be used in very low concentrations that would preserve the meat, but allow any poisonous elements to burn off during the cooking process. But there was a big problem with the way the Eclipse cafeteria was using their sodium nitrite. The cooks were not just using it to preserve meat. They were also using it to season the morning oatmeal. And this was a critical mistake because oatmeal is not cooked nearly as long as meat is. During the longer meat cooking process, the toxins in sodium nitrite evaporate. But with oatmeal, they don't evaporate, and so when the cooks served it to the men, the toxins were definitely still in the oatmeal. And if that was not enough poison, the 11 men who were hospitalized had apparently gotten a whole lot more sodium nitrite straight from the salt shaker on their tables. Lab tests showed that one of the shakers at the Eclipse contained excess sodium nitrite, easily enough to sicken someone. Dr. Pelletieri put the lab results down and smiled. He finally had his answer. He would tell the restaurant about the mix-up right away, and as for the 11 blue men at the hospital, they were unlikely to suffer any long-term health problems from what had happened to them. Dr. Pelletieri thanked Dr. Greenberg, then got up to go spread the good news. That evening, Dr. Pelletieri stopped by the Beekman downtown emergency room on his way home. When he arrived, he learned that 10 of the 11 blue men had been released with a clean bill of health. When he called Dr. Greenberg to let him know, Greenberg said it was nothing short of a miracle. All of the survivors were self-proclaimed alcoholics, and alcoholics often crave salt. He was sure that all of them added salt liberally to their food, unwittingly putting their lives in danger. Dr. Pelletieri agreed, and he wanted to tell these men how lucky they were, but the survivors had been discharged and had all returned to their transient lives out on the streets. He knew he would likely never find them again. Still, they were part of a special group, survivors of being poisoned with sodium nitrite, an event so rare there were only 10 other cases of it ever in recorded history. But that was no help for the 11th blue man, John Marshall. His health had been so bad prior to consuming this sodium nitrite that he had died earlier that evening. Dr. Pelletieri's throat felt tight when he heard that news. He'd conducted his investigation as quickly as possible, but it still was not fast enough to save everyone.
Inside a Washington State hospital in 2003, a young woman was about to give birth, and she was extremely nervous. But not just because she was going to have a baby for the first time. A court officer stood just a few feet away from her, and her eyes never left the expectant mother. And as soon as the baby was born and its umbilical cord was cut, that officer quickly took a vial of the mother and child's blood and then immediately raced out of the room. What that vial contained could save this mother's family, or it could send her to prison. On a cold gray morning in December of 2002, 26-year-old Lydia Fairchild stepped out of her modest apartment in Richland, Washington. Her thick reddish-brown hair was tied back in a ponytail, and there were dark circles under her blue eyes. Lydia had not slept much the night before because there was a lot on her mind. She and her longtime boyfriend, Jamie Townsend, had just broken up again. Their relationship had been through many ups and downs over the last several years. They loved each other, but lately, they just couldn't seem to get along, and so they had finally decided to just end things. It was a tough situation, especially because they shared 2 kids, a 2-year-old boy and a 1-year-old girl. And things had become even more complicated because Lydia had recently found out that she was pregnant again. Lydia walked off the front steps and headed to her car, trying her best to ignore her overflowing mailbox. She didn't need to look at what was in her mailbox to know it was a whole bunch of bills that were all past due. The bills were another reminder of how challenging life had become lately. She was newly single, pregnant, and also unemployed. While Richland, Washington was a comfortable and safe place to call home, trying to find a job there had been a struggle for Lydia, and her savings were now running low. But she did have one thing she was counting on to keep her going. Several weeks ago, she'd applied for welfare benefits, and this morning, she finally got a phone call about her application. Lydia thought everything had been approved, but the person who called her said there was a problem and she would have to come down to the office to talk about it. And so that was where she was going this morning. So Lydia got into her car and she drove to the social services department a few miles away. Meanwhile, the social worker who had called Lydia waited for her in his office. Sitting next to him was his colleague, a woman dressed in a conservative dark blue suit. Neither of them said very much. They were too focused on studying Lydia's case file. The two of them had seen hundreds of welfare applications over the past few years, but never one like Lydia's, and so they were very curious to see what she would have to say. A few minutes later, there was a knock on the door and Lydia entered. Once she sat down, the social worker who had called her got right to the point. There was a problem with the DNA tests that Lydia and her kids had submitted in order to receive these welfare benefits. The results showed that Lydia was not actually the children's mother. For a long moment, Lydia didn't say anything. Then she let out an awkward laugh and told them there had to be some mistake. But the social worker shook his head. DNA testing had a 100% accuracy rate. Lydia just sat back in her chair with this look of total disbelief in her eyes. And it was at this point the social worker's colleague, who was dressed in the dark blue suit, finally spoke up and introduced herself. She told Lydia she was not a social worker, she was a lawyer, and she was with the prosecutor's office. The lawyer got right to the point. Lydia had clearly committed welfare fraud. She had claimed children that were not hers as dependents on her welfare application, and this was a serious crime. And so the lawyer asked Lydia point blank if she was trying to pass these kids off as her own in order to collect a higher welfare payment. And Lydia said no, of course not. Then the lawyer suggested that Lydia must have stolen someone's identity, but Lydia immediately pulled out her driver's license, which had her name on it and all of the information she had included on her application, and Lydia promised the license was real. Lydia insisted that her kids were her natural-born children. She claimed she even had proof since she had their birth certificates and the baby's footprints from the hospital. The lawyer flashed a worried look over at the social worker. Technically, they both knew it was possible that Lydia could have given birth to these kids without actually sharing their DNA, but that could only happen if she was a surrogate mother. And the social worker realized that if that was the case, that could open up a whole other set of very dark possibilities. Lydia could have been paid to be a surrogate, and then when she actually delivered the kids, she could have kidnapped them from their real mother. If that was the case, this situation could go beyond welfare fraud. The real mother could be out there somewhere desperately looking for her kids. Or even worse, perhaps the mother was harmed. The social worker cleared his mind and tried to stay objective. Lydia's horrified reaction to all of their questions made it hard to believe that she was some hardened criminal. But the best scammers could be great actors. And in his career, the social worker had seen plenty of criminals put on Oscar-worthy performances. Finally, after Lydia continued to deny that she had done anything wrong, the social worker and the lawyer told her that she was free to go. But as she gathered her things, the woman from the prosecutor's office gave her a dire warning. Prosecutors were preparing a criminal case against her, and they could take her kids at any moment. Lydia's hands were shaking as she drove home from the interview. She didn't know what to think. All she knew was that she had to get home and figure out what to do next. Lydia rushed through the front door of her apartment and called her mother, Carol. Carol tried her best to calm Lydia down, reminding her that the stress would not be good for her current pregnancy. Lydia promised she would try to relax, and admittedly, it did make her feel better just to talk to her mom. After they hung up, Lydia took a deep, calming breath and then started looking for evidence that could help prove her side of the story. She dug up the children's medical records and birth certificates. She grabbed photos of her with the babies. Then she set it all aside to present to the prosecutor. She was sure it would convince the authorities that she really was the real mother. The next day, about 600 miles away, inside of a prison in Montana, an inmate was lying on his bunk bed. The gray-haired 50-year-old man looked up when he heard the familiar sound of a guard rapping on the bars. The guard told him that someone named Carol was calling him. The inmate's name was Rod Fairchild, and he was Lydia's father. Carol was Lydia's mom and Rod's ex-wife. If she was calling, Rod knew it meant something was wrong. Rod sat up and followed the guard to the prison's call center. The moment he picked up the receiver, he could tell that Carol was very upset. She told him everything that was happening to Lydia, that she was in trouble over a DNA test and was now being accused of committing welfare fraud. Rod told her to stay calm and that he was sure there must have been some mistake, and he was positive it would all get cleared up soon. But after the call ended, Rod dropped the optimism he had shared with Carol. As he headed back to his cell, he couldn't help but think about the DNA evidence. He wanted to believe his daughter, but he knew DNA didn't lie. And if she tried to fight DNA evidence in court, he was afraid she would lose. As her father, Rod felt terrible about the whole situation, and he even felt a little bit guilty. After all, he was serving time for business fraud, and now his daughter was in trouble over welfare fraud, and so he knew he had not set a great example for his child. Either way, Rod wondered if his daughter had gotten herself into trouble and was now trying to cover it up. The following week, the prosecutor, who was now in charge of Lydia's case, was busy building a case against her. He had to be absolutely certain that there had not been an error with Lydia's DNA test. Although it was highly unlikely, Lydia's samples could have been accidentally switched with someone else's, or maybe they had been tainted somehow. So just to be safe, he ordered Lydia and her kids to come in and submit 3 more DNA samples for testing. It took a few months to process the tests, but sometime around March of 2003, the prosecutor had his answer. And it was exactly what he expected. The prosecutor phoned Lydia to tell her the results. According to this second round of testing, Lydia was still not the children's biological mother. Lydia insisted these results were wrong too, and she began to argue with the prosecutor. She asked if the authorities had seen the birth certificates, the baby footprints, and all the photos of her with the kids. The prosecutor told Lydia that yes, they'd seen them, but it didn't matter. Nobody was denying that she gave birth to the kids. They're denying that they are her kids. At this point, the authorities were convinced that Lydia was running some sort of surrogacy scam. With the newest rounds of DNA tests in their hands, they had everything they needed to convict Lydia. The prosecutor informed her she'd be receiving a court summons and advised her to hire a lawyer. Lydia hung up from the prosecutor in a total daze. She knew she was in deep trouble. Lydia didn't have any time to waste, so she pulled out a phone book and started going through the yellow pages looking for family law attorneys. She explained her situation to each one, but they all said the same thing. There was no sense in fighting DNA evidence, and so none of the lawyers she contacted would agree to represent her. They knew they would lose. By the end of April, when Lydia was 8 months pregnant, she was a total nervous wreck and basically wasn't eating. She had to borrow money since she never got her welfare benefits, and she couldn't get a job because of all the legal trouble she was in. Her first hearing was in a few weeks, on May 16, 2003, and somehow she'd have to argue her case in front of a judge without a lawyer. On May 16, 2003, Lydia's case went to court. This was a preliminary hearing to determine what would happen to her kids while her case proceeded. The judge overseeing the hearing sat in his chambers, reviewing the evidence against Lydia. He thought it was the strangest case he'd ever seen. The prosecution wanted to put her son and daughter in foster care, and it was now up to him, the judge, to decide. He put on his robe and walked into the courtroom, curious to meet the mother. Lydia, who was now 9 months pregnant, struggled to stand up when the judge entered the courtroom. When the judge sat down, he took a closer look at Lydia. She looked ready to give birth at any moment. The judge asked Lydia when she was due, and she told him she was scheduled to be induced into labor in just 3 days. The judge thought about this. Taking the kids away from her at this point, even if they were not technically her kids, seemed unnecessarily cruel. And so he told Lydia that he was prepared to let her keep custody of the kids for the moment, but he had conditions. He needed her and the newborn baby to submit a fresh round of DNA samples. A court officer would literally be present for the birth of this third kid, and the second that baby was born, they would take its DNA to be tested. The following Monday, May 19, 2003, Lydia checked into the hospital. She was induced into labor, and sure enough, the court officer who was in the room witnessed her give birth to a baby boy, who Lydia named Jamie II after her former boyfriend and the father of the baby. As nurses huddled around the newborn, the court officer tapped a lab technician on the shoulder. Before Lydia could hold little Jamie for the first time, the tech drew a vial of blood from the baby. He handed the vial to the court officer, who promptly turned and headed for the door. Before the officer left the room, she looked back for a moment. As Lydia now cuddled with her newborn son for the first time, it was hard for the court officer to believe that this woman was anything but a genuine loving mother. The officer looked down at the vial in her hand. It would prove whether Lydia was this baby's biological mother, or if she was really the scheming liar that prosecutors claimed she was. 2 weeks later, the results from Lydia and her new baby's blood tests came back. It showed that, once again, she and her child did not share any DNA, so she could not be the baby's biological mother. Prosecutors were more sure than ever that Lydia was in fact running some kind of surrogacy scam. Now Lydia was in even bigger trouble than before. And without a lawyer, she ran an even bigger risk of losing her case. Just a few days after Lydia's newest DNA results came back showing she was not the biological mother of her newest baby, a 41-year-old attorney named Alan Tyndall sat down at his cluttered desk with his morning coffee. He had a stack of paperwork that he was not looking forward to doing that day, so when his secretary patched through a potential client, he was happy to take the call. It was Lydia, and as Alan listened to her story, he wasn't sure what to make of her. Like any good lawyer, he knew DNA evidence was the gold standard. But Alan enjoyed a challenge. He was a proud military veteran and former public defender. He was used to taking on tough situations. Alan was especially curious about Lydia's most recent DNA test. To his knowledge, the only way a woman could give birth to a baby that was not hers was if she was a surrogate. But Lydia said she wasn't, and this child and the other two were really her biological children. Alan had never heard of someone successfully overturning DNA evidence, but he believed everyone had a right to legal representation, and somehow he believed that Lydia had to be telling the truth. And so he told her he would take her case. With Lydia's next court date looming, Alan got straight to work. He spent long nights at his office looking for any logical way to defend her, but he kept arriving at the same conclusion. There was no fighting DNA evidence. After several weeks, Alan was still no closer to finding a way to defend Lydia, until one morning, his secretary brought him a recent edition of the New England Journal of Medicine. It came with a note from a colleague. There was an article they thought could be relevant to Lydia's case. At first, Alan shrugged it off. Lydia's case was starting to make the local news because it was so unusual, and so as a result, Alan had been getting a lot of unsolicited advice from people who had seen her story on the news. But Alan was not making much progress on his own, so he picked up the thick journal and started to flip through it. And by the time he got to the end, his eyes were wide. He could not believe what he had just read. It was a long shot, but if what he had read was true, it could be the key to winning this impossible case. Alan's first step was to convince the judge to postpone the trial. He explained that Lydia needed to undergo more in-depth testing to try out this new theory he had, and it could take months to get the results. The judge agreed to delay the court date until April of 2004, nearly a year away. Alan was confident that would give them enough time. And so right away, he sent Lydia off to lab after lab where she underwent a battery of tests. Then they waited. Almost a year went by, and Alan was still waiting for the results, and the date for Lydia's hearing was fast approaching. One night, Alan was in his office working on his opening statement for Lydia's case when his phone rang. It was the doctor overseeing Lydia's lab work, and he told Alan he had some bad news. There was still too much data to analyze, and Lydia's test results wouldn't be ready in time for her hearing. Alan could not hide his disappointment. This was a huge setback, but he knew the judge wouldn't delay the trial any longer. And so, in April of 2004, Alan and Lydia walked into the courthouse where her trial would finally take place. Once they were seated, Alan leaned over to reassure her. Then he stood up and faced the judge. Alan didn't have the science-based evidence that he'd been counting on this whole time. What he had instead was a very strange story to tell, and everything in the whole case came down to whether he could get the judge to believe it. He began to explain why a schoolteacher who lived 3,000 miles away in Boston, Massachusetts, and who had never met or even heard of Lydia, could prove his client was innocent. That schoolteacher's name was Karen Keegan, and in the late 1990s, Karen was sick and needed a kidney transplant. Hoping her sons would be a match, they all took a DNA test. And just like Lydia, the results showed there was a 0% chance that Karen was the mother of her kids. But unlike Lydia, Karen was able to find out why. A Harvard doctor looked into her case and suggested an extremely bizarre scenario. Karen was something called a human chimera. This condition was named after a creature from Greek mythology who had a lion's head, a goat's body, and a serpent's tail. So basically, it was several different animals rolled into one. When a woman conceives twins, it's because 2 eggs in her womb have been fertilized. On extremely rare occasions, the 2 eggs then fuse a few days after fertilization, and when that happens, the resulting embryo becomes one fetus with 2 different genetic codes. This is a human chimera. And once it's born, different parts of its body have unique strands of DNA. That explained why Karen Keegan didn't come up as a genetic match for both of her sons. The sample they had tested came from her other set of DNA. But then they tested different parts of Karen's body, her hair, her skin, even her bladder, and eventually they found DNA that did match her sons, and it came from Karen's thyroid gland. Allen argued that Lydia had to be a chimera too. Essentially, he was telling the judge that Lydia was her own twin. And because of this, samples may have been taken from a part of Lydia's body that had a different set of DNA than her kids. Unfortunately, they still had not found any tissue within Lydia that matched her kids' DNA yet. But they did have something. Allen had gotten Lydia's mom tested, and that test proved that at least she, the mother, shared DNA with Lydia's children. That meant either Lydia or Lydia's sister had to be the kid's mother. The judge took a moment to digest the evidence. If all his years on the bench taught him one thing, it was that DNA tests were always right. But Allen's argument was very compelling. Then the judge made his announcement. He told the court he believed Lydia Fairchild was indeed the mother of these kids. In his opinion, the story of Karen Keegan, paired with the new DNA results of Lydia's mother, proved that Lydia had to be a human chimera. And so the judge dismissed Lydia's case and admitted that he was wrong. After almost 2 years, Lydia's ordeal was finally over. She burst into tears as Allen put his arm around her. She had been telling the truth, as crazy as it sounded, the whole time. A few months later, doctors were able to finally show that Lydia's DNA did match her kids. They found the matching DNA from a cervical smear. Lydia Fairchild went down in textbooks as only one of 100 human chimeras ever identified. And while her ordeal would forever haunt her, it did bring her family closer together than they ever had been before. Lydia and her ex-boyfriend, Jamie Townsend, did get back together long enough to have a 4th child. This time around, because the world knew that Lydia was a human chimera, nobody questioned if she was the mother.